Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today we have a follow-up video on this little amplifier which I've reviewed previously a week or two ago, depending on when you're watching this of course. I've got some distortion figures to show you and a circuit. Now first of all I want to talk about the circuit. This little amplifier, it's basically made out of what's available, and there are lots and lots of different companies distributing this or selling it if you like, and what you get at the end of the day is a bit of a hit and miss affair. I'm going to show you now some images of the boards that I have. And the two boards that I have are very similar, as you'd expect, coming from the same supplier at the same time. The other images I'm going to show you is from a different distributor, and it's images that Ron has sent me. Now his is clearly somewhat different to mine. They're all the same components, more or less. But you can see, if you look at these pictures here, these are images of my board, and you can see the power transistors are, if you like, a long way off. They're mounted a long way off the actual printed board. And I had no problems in mounting these to a heatsink whatsoever. But look at these. These are images of Ron's boards, and you can see they're a different batch. The transistors have had their leads well and truly cropped. The problem is they're mounted so low on the board you can't actually easily mount these to a heatsink. You'll see why if you look at the pictures carefully, because the transistors are laid well back inside the board, if you like, and don't stick out as much as they should to allow you to mount the transistors on a heatsink without the board actually stopping you from doing this. It's debatable depending on how you're going to mount it. But if your boards happen to be the ones that have got the transistors really cropped like that, you could actually have a bit of a problem in mounting these to your heatsink. Another issue is, if you like, the quality control of the boards. This is a picture of the front of the board showing the small signal transistors, and they're all put in the board quite nicely. This one, as opposed to this one, which is Ron's board, where the transistors are all leaning over to one side. I know technically it doesn't matter because they're all soldered reasonably well, and it's just sloppy manufacturing really, isn't it? Let's talk about the circuit in general. Here is an image that Ron has put together of the circuit diagram. There are lots of different circuit diagrams, all reputed to be the same. The circuits do vary quite a bit from one to the other, so for us to put up a circuit and say this is it, when it might not be it, other than to say it's pretty close to the average of what we've found so far. Look at the circuit by all means, but please don't think this is the gospel. It might be the circuit of the board you've got, but it might not. The basic circuit dates back to the early days of directly coupled transistor amplifiers. The one that you see here is typical of many of the tuner amplifiers and medium to low cost amplifiers that were on the market in the late 70s and early 80s. It's an okay circuit. It's not brilliant. It's very typical of what you'd find in medium priced tuner amplifiers or just amplifiers of that era. And by today's standards, as you'll see a bit later on, the circuit's quite primitive. There's no adjustments on it. That means that it only really gives good performance at one supply voltage. For example, look at this sine wave here. You can see quite plainly a notch which is crossover distortion basically, and that's what happens if you run it at a very low voltage. It says it will run from plus or minus 10 volts. Well, it will run, but the quiescent current at that level, at that voltage, is minuscule. The effect is you can see notches on the sine wave here. So to actually see a notch like that, that's quite a lot of crossover distortion, and really it's not suitable. I've mentioned previously that the sweet spot of this amplifier is plus and minus 35 volts. 30 volts if you like, more than 35 volts if you're very brave. Make sure you have a speaker protection module. The reason for this is most amplifiers make a noise when you switch on or turn off, and it's purely the DC conditions sorting themselves out. So it's not a fault, but it does mean that sometimes you get a click or a thump. It's not really terribly good for your loudspeakers, but the most important thing is these speaker protection modules have a delay on switch on of usually 2 to 3 seconds, just long enough that your preamp feeding into it, all that stuff is muted until the amplifier is stable and ready to be connected to your speaker. So that delay is pretty important. Most importantly, if there's a problem with your amplifier, or in the case of many DC coupled amplifiers, if there's a problem with the signal going in that's producing DC, your speakers won't like it. And when you think to replace the bass units, because it shouldn't affect the tweeter because that's usually capacitively coupled, but your bass unit often will not have a capacitor in series with the speaker. Could do, but not always. So that means if anything goes wrong with the amplifier, you could have 35 volts, or at worst, double that 70 volts going through your bass units and your speaker, which they will not survive that. They really won't. And however fast you are, you will never get to it in time to save your speakers. So work out the cost of replacing the bass units in your speaker, and then work out the cost of a speaker protection module, which is usually about $15, $20. Right, let's have a quick chat now about distortion. As I mentioned to you earlier, this is not the ultimate in hi-fi amplifiers. But if you compare it to the valve preamp of a couple of videos ago, this is super wonderful. It's not as good as some of the better amplifiers that I've even reviewed on this channel. At normal listening level of 3 or 4 watts output, the THD is reasonably good at 0.13, but it's higher than the better amplifiers today, but certainly fairly respectable. I wouldn't get overexcited about it being high like that. The next one I'm going to show you is increasing the power to about 50%. The distortion then is going up to 0.33%. Certainly okay for most applications, And the final distortion I'm going to show you is just prior to clipping. In fact, it is actually just about clipping. So the figure is actually 2.54%. But that would not be very pleasant to listen to. And it's the figure you get when you look at the distortion going along like this, and then it starts to rise and then goes, as is typical of a transistor amplifier. So this is I wish I could speak. This is the distortion just on that notch where it's just starting to head vertically. If you've got an old vintage receiver from the 70s that uses one of those ICs that were very popular, can't think of the name of them at the moment, don't be tempted to buy a replacement to that because they're all fakes. You might like to consider one of these boards because you can see how easy it is to mount them. Don't forget, by the way, that you don't get mica washers or any insulation for these transistors. And if you forget to do that, there will be a lot of smoke. There really will. You don't want to do that. If you've got an old vintage receiver that you can't mend with the appropriate components, one of these, or a pair preferably, would be fine. It's a low-cost repair and it won't be any worse a performance than the performance of the original vintage receiver. Because I know it's popular these days to think that vintage receivers, particularly of the medium to low price, we'll ignore the high price ones for the moment because clearly you wouldn't use a module like this to replace the power amplifiers. In all honesty, these are as good as the original circuits on many of the well-known brands, Pioneer, Rotel, Panasonic, Techniques, well, same thing. They all would use a similar quality circuit as this. So if you do have an old machine like that, don't throw it away. These are cheap and there's usually enough space to remove the old amplifier and pop these in. And the 35 volts that many, bearing in mind you do need a split supply, a plus and a minus 35. So if your receiver has only got a single rail, you can't use these. So that's it. Toodaloo.